to everyone for joining us today. You're in for a treat. We have 4 incredible presentations by the Latin American Genetics Consortium. This group is led by 4 investigators. They're here to present their work to you. I'm not going to take up too much time to introduce each of them. The work they've done will really speak for itself. You're going to hear about psychiatric genetics in Latin America. We're going to start with the prospects of that research and what we're able to do. You're going to hear about the goals that this group has, their aspirations, and the really impressive plans that they have for conducting this research in an inclusive manner, in a way that represents the cultures and communities that they will be working and interfacing with. And then we're going to end with some challenges that are derived and opportunities really for us to grow as a community of psychiatric geneticists. And so that's going to be an interesting set of presentations and comments based on a survey that the Latin American Genetics Consortium put together. So I'm going to hand this over to our first speaker, Dr. Nicolini, who's going to present on the prevalence of psychiatric disorders in Latin America. Over to you, Humberto.
Thank you very much, Arpana. And it's a great pleasure to be here with all of you and to present a little bit of my impression of the psychiatric disorders in Latin America. I'm a clinical psychiatrist, and I've been practicing psychiatry in Mexico, but touring around Latin America. And this is data from the World Health Organization. And the prevalence of mental disorders across all different world regions in the Americas it's one of the highest prevalence, taking all the different mental disorders. And the region of the Americans, the 2 disorders that account for the highest prevalence are anxiety and depressive disorders. And from those, it's very interesting that the prevalence on females are the ones who have the highest peak on the region of the Americans. So that's pretty interesting compared to the rest of the worldwide population. In terms of suicide, which is a major concern for all the world and also is one of my research areas, the low and middle income countries in the Americas, they don't have a highest rates of suicide compared to the high income countries. And that's an interesting phenomena that we need to do a lot more in all the environment aspects of suicide, as long as all the genetic data in suicide, but it's a great area of opportunity. In terms of DALYs, the region of the Americas, there is a lot of disparities between the different countries. In some of the regions, there is a huge burden of the mental disorders, like in the United States, Brazil, Chile, and in some other regions, it seems that the data is not as impressive, and it may have some reasons for that may rely on the access to care that I will present in the following slides, and also the perceptions of the mental disorders in some other parts of the region. And for example, also the GDP, the percentage of the GDP that is dedicated to health in the different countries in the Americas, it's very diverse. It's very interesting that like Cuba, they dedicate a much higher percentage of the GDP to health compared to the United States, or even higher than Canada. And the 4th country in America is Costa Rica, but the rest of the Latin American countries, they don't spend that much money on health in general. And when we also, just to give us an idea of the gross domestic product in some of the Latin American countries compared to some of the US cities, just the GDP of New York is higher than all of the Latin American countries, higher than Brazil, that is the biggest or the biggest economy of Mexico. A city like Las Vegas, the GDP is much higher than Cuba, Ecuador, Guatemala. So it's very impressive. I thought that this data, just in terms of the differences in income in the Latin American countries and the amount that could be dedicated to health and then to mental health, you could imagine how it works. And this is a life expectancy in the region of the Americas and in the Latin Americans and the Caribbean, and it's much lower than compared to the North America part. It's almost by 8% lower, almost like 8 years lower the life expectancy in the Latin American countries and the Caribbean compared to North America. And also the evaluation of how Latin American healthcare compares to Europe or North America. Most of the Latin American countries, the amount of money that is dedicated on some other index are much in a lower status. Even countries that dedicate a lot of the gross domestic product, still the quality of the healthcare is not very high. Also, what are the main causes of death in most of the Latin American countries? And it's very impressive that in a lot of the Latin American countries, violence is reported as one of the major cause of death in a lot of the Latin American countries, and directly that, of course, relates to mental health. Drug use, in the U.S., one of the leading causes of death, but in some other Latin America is not considered as that. Suicide in Uruguay is the second lead cause of death. So I think it's interesting data, but in general, violence is a major issue in most of the Latin American countries. Also, violence is related to suicide in some Latin American countries. We did that research in Mexico City, and in the areas where most violence occurs, also suicide tends to be higher. In general, in Latin America, there has been a tendency to reduce the amount of psychiatric beds in the last 20 years. In a lot of countries, the policy has been to reduce the large psychiatric hospital, the asylum model that is dictated by the World Health Organization. But the problem is that the general hospitals, they have not prepared to accept psychiatric patients. So they are closing psychiatric beds, but they are not opening facilities to attend psychiatric patients in the general hospital. So, that is giving a problem that most of the incarcerations are increasing along the psychiatric beds are decreasing, and that's a phenomenon that is seen in most of the Latin American countries. So the toll of closing psychiatric beds is going through the legal system, and that's happening all over in Latin America. Also the treatment gap, the access to care, it tends to be low, even though we have a very high rates when we assess them from the epidemiological perspective. The amount of disorders that go to service utilization is not as high as we could preview from the epidemiological rates. And this is also happening in a lot of the Latin American countries, that the people are not using the services as expected. And also the way that the psychiatrists view, if they should rely on primary care physicians to treat a lot of the psychiatric disorders like anxiety or depression, even though we don't have enough psychiatrists. they don't agree with that. So they tend not to participate in many of the training of the general care physicians. And a lot of the psychiatrists, they think that we should keep the management of most of the psychiatric disorders, including anxiety and depression, and do not delegate those into the general care physicians. Also, the lagging behind education, it's very impressive, especially higher education in most of the Latin American countries. We have a very few people with higher education compared to North America, and it's much bigger, that difference in educational attainment in most of the Latin American countries. And even that has been reported in some studies on cognition with schizophrenia, in which the rates of cognitive decline with the years of education is much more pronounced as a phenotype in patients in many Latin American countries in this study published by some people in different Latin American countries. So we have to pay attention to these phenotypes. Also, this kind of data that is interesting, Argentina has the most psychologists all over the world. So that's interesting. And also some of the Latin America countries like Costa Rica and Cuba, they have a lot of psychologists. So it's a big task force, but that do not really reflect on a best psychiatric or mental health care in the population. So that was kind of an interesting data. So as a conclusion, Latin America, I think it's a great area of opportunities in psychiatry and mental health, but there are big economic, education, and health disparities, and access and psychiatric care have some particularities in the region that we have to take care when we are doing research in this particular area of the world. And thanks a lot for your attention, and please go on with the next speakers.
Thank you so much, Humberto. I just wanted to, before I transition this to Dr. Giusti-Rodriguez, I wanted to encourage us all to please post questions. You can use the Q&A box. Our speakers welcome questions in English, Portuguese, and Spanish. So you can either wait to the end and we'll have some time for speakers to ask those questions, and for the attendees to ask those questions, and our speakers will translate them. Or you can put them in the chat box at any time. I'm going to hand this over to Paola for our next talk.
Hi, everyone. So so I'm going to take it from what Dr. Nicolini covered and talk about, so where are we now in terms of psychiatric genetic studies in Latin America and where we want to be. Sorry. Okay, so there's a pressing need to engage more diverse research participants and researchers in order to diversify psychiatric genomic studies. I apologize. And not only psychiatric genomic studies, but also the genetics workforce. And we have limited data on the understanding of the specific genetic susceptibility of diverse and mixed populations. And as we'll talk about in the next two parts of the talk, there's a real need for input and involvement of the communities in Latin America. And so as most of our audience today is aware, psychiatric genomic studies are still suffering from a lack of diversity in the ancestry of populations that are studied. As shown on the left, individuals of European ancestry are still overrepresented in psychiatric GWAS studies compared to other global populations. And the exclusion of underrepresentation of other populations can prevent us from taking full advantage of the discoveries, in terms of that can inform disease prevention or the development of new treatments. As has been shown by Alicia Martin and colleagues, this becomes a serious problem when findings from these genomic studies are then applied to clinical settings, since these polygenic risk scores that can be derived tend to be calculated from if they're calculated from European populations, then they're not necessarily transferable to non-European populations. And so when using it as a clinical tool, really, like it can lead to an exacerbation of already existing health disparities in underserved communities and populations. Within the PGC, this lack of diversity is reflected in terms both in the number of investigators and samples under study from Latin America. The map on the top left shows that the co-authorships on PGC papers, and clearly there's a worldwide collaboration, but it's still not complete. And particularly in the case of Latin America, we can see that there's still a lot of room for growth. The map on the bottom right is a snapshot of the distribution of samples analyzed by the PGC. And again, many regions of the world, there's an apparent underrepresentation in psychiatric genomic studies, and that's definitely the case for Latin America. Continuing the sort of the thread that Dr. Nicolini started, there are many reasons for this underrepresentation that is seen in terms of the investigators and the samples that are studied. As Dr. Marco Santoro will cover some of these limitations and barriers, but I wanted to highlight the fact that one of the major reasons for this underrepresentation is the lack of funding. So here I'm showing the percentage of the GDP and in terms of like research and development expenditures across Latin American countries. This is data from the World Bank. And so as you can see that there is a disinvestment in terms of research and development. And keep in mind that these numbers are a few years old, and they've been affected in the past 3 to 5 years in terms of the COVID-19 pandemic and political instability in some of the countries that in the region. And if you compare these numbers for these countries, the US spends about 2.8% of its GDP in research and development. There are some additional barriers in terms of research capacity, lack of collaborative opportunities, the existing genomics and computer infrastructure, and the lack of adequate methods that can account for the complex admixture that's observed across the region. And again, we'll touch on these in the next two talks. Thankfully, the tide may be turning for some of these barriers. Again, as that will be discussed by Dr. Santoro and Montalvo-Ortiz. And there's a lot of efforts across Latin America and from the PGC with Latin American investigators that can hopefully impact both on a short term and long term. But the main message is like there are large number of samples that are needed to really, make inroads in terms of this like polygenic disorders, such as psychiatric disorders. And there's, because of the large degree of admixture in the region, really this needs very large scale samples and substantial investment and collaborations. And so we've been working, the LAGC has been working on a review. So I wanted to give sort of a snapshot of where things stand in terms of large scale GWAS across the region, and also provide some highlights of things that are already yielding results. And so given the previously mentioned limitations, the majority of the studies across the region have been linkage or candidate gene studies, but there are examples of GWASs, particularly for substance use disorders, where there are at least 5 SUD GWASs that have been published covering alcohol consumption, alcohol use disorders, smoking, and other SUDs that have included substantial Latin American samples of Latin American individuals. For other psychiatric disorders such as depression, there haven't been any replicated findings, but there have been efforts, particularly using samples from the Hispanic Community Health Study or the study of Latinos. Same for anxiety, no replicated findings, but they have analyzed this trait in that cohort, and there have been efforts, publications on suicide. But again, one other of the PGC groups, the PTSD group, has been increasing the representation of Latin American samples on their analysis. But still, there's still a lot of room for growth, and hopefully future efforts, including for bipolar disorder, the neuropsychiatric genetics of psychosis in the Mexican populations, or NeuroMex, will make inroads. And there's other recently funded NIMH projects, many of which are part of the Ancestral Populations Network, which should significantly increase the number of samples from Latin American individuals for autism spectrum disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, severe mental illness, including bipolar, schizophrenia, and psychosis and suicide. Again, despite financial limitations, science gets done, and there are many Latin American researchers carrying out psychiatric genomic studies in the region, and there's room for growth. And the major goals of the Worldwide Lab meeting is to highlight opportunities for collaborations across the region. So I wanted to highlight some of the work that's being done in terms of this, which I wanted to highlight the Brazilian high-risk cohort for mental conditions and the Mexican Genomic Database for Addiction Research, which are really have been the basis for many studies that have already been done and are currently underway to look at various psychiatric disorders. Within the US, there are efforts across biobanks and large-scale genomic studies to increase the representation of admixed individuals in genomic studies, such as including 23andMe, the Million Veteran Program, All of Us, and PsychEmerge. And finally, work by Dr. Elizabeth Atkinson, another co-leader of the Latin American Genomics Consortium, and others are aiding in the analysis of samples across ancestries and of diverse admixture. There are also efforts to improve reference panels, which should aim in the interpretation of analysis of future large-scale psychiatric GWAS with substantial representation across ancestry and populations. And I'm going to hand it over now to Janitza.
Great, thank you, Paola. Let me share a screen here. Okay, good. So gonna basically address all the challenges that have been discussed so far and the need to advance psychiatry genomics research in terms of representation of researchers in psychiatry genomics field, but also in terms of representation of Latin Americans in psychiatry genomics studies. So my title of my talk is how do we get there? And we are gonna propose of the establishment of the Latin American Genomics Consortia, one of the answers to address these needs. So as we learned in Paola's talk, there is an urgent need to address the lack of Latin American representation, and we need to do this at every level in psychiatry genomic studies, from recruitment efforts focused not only in aggregating samples, but also supporting local efforts in Latin American countries to more culturally informed assessment accessible in their native language, to developing more informative reference panels and methods that account for the complex admixture as we have in Latin American ancestry, and generating databases for functional annotation in Latin American individuals. Altogether, these will help achieve our goal to improve representation and develop clinical tools that can benefit our populations. To address this urgent need, we founded the Latin American Genomics Consortia. It was first established in 2019 at the World Congress of Psychiatry Genetics. From initial 25 people in that event, we have grown in the last couple of years to 125 active members, representing 9 different Latin American countries, Puerto Rico, and the United States. Our main aim is to advance psychiatry genomic studies in Latin America, and we're going to focus on 4 different areas: increasing sample sizes of current GWAS studies, working on methods development, supporting recruitment and genotyping efforts, and providing educational and training resources. One of our major goals is to bring together and empower Latin American psychiatry genomics researchers. As you can see on the top map and bar graph, so far we have been able to recruit investigators from 9 Latin American countries, plus Puerto Rico and the US. We expect to continue growing this network into additional Latin American countries and the Caribbean. The map and bar graph in the bottom show the academic affiliations of our members. Some of these affiliations are listed on the right panel. We also aim to have equitable representation in our membership. We want to make sure we're including not only full professors, but also mid-career and early career investigators, as well as trainees. The graphs on the top show the distribution of academic titles of LAGC members, the distribution of trainees, and the fact that we have equitable representation across sexes. LAGC members have diverse research interests within psychiatry genomics, as evidenced in the bottom two graphs, which show research areas and the specific disorders or trait of interest. To have an idea of the actual status of the publications that LAGC members led and their collaborations, we conducted a network analysis depicting the first and last author publications of LAGC members and their collaborations within our members by author names and the country of their academic affiliation. And we can observe a high number of collaborations within LAGC members that are based in the US. However, for researchers in Latin America, a substantial lower number of collaborations is observed, with several LAGC members remaining in isolated cluster. We hope that LAGC can help improve this in the coming years. And here we're just showing the establishment of different collaborations that we were able to have in the last couple of years, from the PGC, obviously, to different large-scale efforts based in the US, but also based in Latin America. Those based in Latin America mostly shown on the right. And we also wanted to highlight the selection of our PGC representatives, Dr. Humberto Nicolini, one of our speakers, and also Marco Santoro, the last speaker of our talk. Humberto Nicolini representing Latin America with affiliation of Instituto Nacional de Medicina Genómica in Mexico, and Dr. Marco Santoro in Universidade Federal de Sao Paulo, Brazil. And we're really sure we're going to be well represented in the PGC. In terms of the accomplishments, we have grown our efforts on sample genotyping. So far, we have included samples that are informative for disorders such as like schizophrenia, bipolar disorders, and substance use disorders, reaching to 5,000, almost 6,000 samples from Mexico, Costa Rica, Puerto Rico, Chile, and the United States. And this has been due to the support of the PGC, from funds from the PGC grants from NIMH, and more recently from NIDA. In terms of data access, we have secured access to close to 100,000 samples of Latin American ancestry, including cohorts that are based in the US and in Latin America. In terms of data analysis, we completed our initial analytical effort by conducting meta-GWAS of alcohol consumption in more than 50,000 Latin Americans, and we're currently expanding to other psychiatry-related traits. And this is possible due to the recent establishment of LAGC working groups, so sort of mimicking the PGC working groups and trying to have representation for each of the psychiatry disorders. We have recently launched the working groups of ADHD, methods development group, eating disorders, major depressive disorders, suicides, and substance use disorders, and additional groups will be upcoming. To talk a little bit more about our data aggregation efforts, we are working on bringing together as much psychiatrically relevant Latin American data as possible. We have obtained data access to several large-scale data sets with Latin American participants, including the Million Veterans Programs, the Study of Latinos, the Boston Puerto Rican Health Study, the Mexican Genomic Database for Addiction Research, and the UK Biobank, and also the Brazilian high-risk cohort. And additional securement of data access will be from PAGE cohort and the PGC PTSD, as well as different ones listed on the right. We're particularly motivated to also work towards a good coverage of our participants across Latin America, both for equitable representation of researchers, but also, of course, to try and capture the immense genetic diversity observed within and across Latin American cohorts. Depending on the area of Latin America that you look, We observe widely varying degrees of European, Native American, and African global ancestry proportions, as shown in the review figure on the left, as well as some impressive diversity in local ancestry composition that we are exploring ourselves. So as an example, we're showing on the right mixture plots from two of our cohorts, the Mexican Genomic Database for Addiction Research and the Boston Puerto Rican Health Study. The Mexican Genomic Database for Addiction Research is a population-based sample from Mexico recruited in 2016, which Dr. Humberto Nicolini is leading. And the Boston Puerto Rican Health Study is a sample of Puerto Rican older individuals residing in Boston. These again illustrate the component global ancestry proportion for the individuals of each cohort. On the top is the Mexican Genomic Diversity cohort, and on the bottom is the Boston Puerto Rican Health Study. And these were run by our amazing postdoc and primary analyst, Dr. Martinez Magaña. The plots are ordered based on the proportions of the dark blue ancestry, which here represent the Native American ancestry proportions. Red represents the African ancestry proportions, and turquoise, the European. As you can see, the admixture proportions show clear differences between these two cohorts, with the Mexican ancestry and Puerto Ricans higher proportions of African ancestry, which mirrors what has been observed in previous work on these populations. Oops, sorry. And as I mentioned earlier, we are in the process of aggregating many more data sets from across other areas of Latin America, and look forward to capturing more of this fantastic diversity. We're also showing here the principal component plots depicting the diversity and admixture of the Latin American populations of these four cohorts. We conducted the principal component analyses and projected these using the Human Genome Diversity Project. In the right, we show all the cohorts together. As we could see, there is a high genomic diversity in these cohorts. And meanwhile, in the left, we show each of the analyzed cohorts highlighted in red, and we could see different degrees of genomic diversity patterns, from those going from Native Americans to European as the Mexican cohort, or those from European to African as the Puerto Rican cohort. Further, we could also see a more complex admixture in the Brazilian cohort. So for this, we conducted the GWAS of alcohol consumption as our pilot dig into aggregating different cohorts for GWAS meta-analysis efforts. And we conducted a random effects meta-GWAS for alcohol consumption in 5 Latin American cohorts: the MVP, SOL, Boston Puerto Rican Health Study, Brazilian high-risk cohort, and the Mexican Genomic Diversity of Addiction Research cohort. For 4 of them, we performed new GWAS. So for the SOL, the Boston Puerto Rican Health Study, Brazilian high-risk cohort, and Mexican Genomic Diversity cohort. And basically, we identified and used the summary statistics from MVP, and we identified 12 genome-wide significant hits mapping to ADH1C, which is a very well-known gene for alcohol research in genomic studies, and as well as RAP1GDS1 and MTTP. We identify other potential association in chromosome 14 mapping to CEP128, which we observe associations in MVP, but also Boston Puerto Rican Health Study and the Mexican Genomic Diversity cohorts. More details on this, please attend Jaime's talk at WCPG, and we hope to have the resulting paper very soon. So also the methods working group led by Elizabeth Atkinson and Carolina Capi are focused on ironing out the best practices for genomic research in Latin American samples, with particular consideration of the high level of genetic and cultural diversity. Specifically, we're in the process of building a computational pipeline for genotype data QC given input arrays, which is a type of genetic data that is most commonly held by our members. This pipeline will be extremely user-friendly, and we will ensure that it works across a range of compute environments, including the LISA high-performance computing cluster from PGC. We're also designing protocols for harmonized samples, variant, and phenotype QC. Should users not be able to use the pipeline for whatever reason, we will have a set of thresholds for QC and data processing so that steps can be followed as similarly as possible across cohorts for the harmonized set of data. For phenotype QC, we're planning on building custom protocols for filtering with thresholds and particular considerations for analysis contributed by each of our phenotype working groups to make sure that the protocol is tailored appropriately. And one related effort that is extremely important but less widely discussed is that we're working to ensure that all of our members have access to high performance computing for analysis. Some of our members have their own clusters in their local institutions, but many of the other members, Lisa is actually a great solution for this. But there are some groups that in countries where access to Lisa is still restricted. Hopefully we can improve that. So we're working on finding a solution for computing and make sure that everyone can participate and analyze their own data with sufficient computational resources. So I'm just gonna briefly talk about this, and just to highlight that LAGC is strongly committed to promoting equity and sustainability in psychiatry genomics research and across Latin American researchers. So this is a very quick question that we did last year to sort of have an idea of the kind of needs that each country will have help that will facilitate moving psychiatry genetics research forward. This is a word cloud just showing one of different terms. But in our next talk by Dr. Marco Santoro, we're gonna go deeply on this, and he will be presenting amazing data and recommendations from a more detailed survey that he conducted within LAGC members. So with that, I want to leave Dr. Marco Santoro for the next talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Janitza. Okay, so hi, my name is Marco Santoro. I'm currently an assistant professor at the Federal University of São Paulo. And today I will present a survey we did with our members and also some other Latin American researchers. And it was a survey mainly focusing on the difficulties in Latin American research. So, as Janitza just presented, LAGC main aim is to advance psychiatric genomic studies in Latin America, and aiming these topics as increased representation, improve education and training, and also to develop new methods. And well, the main idea of this survey was to hear the Latin American researchers so we could identify which are the main difficulties of Latin American researchers, and also after that to plan future strategies to help each of these difficulties in the survey. So we got 65 answers in the survey. Most of the individuals were really Latin Americans, most of them located in Latin America, but also Latin American researchers doing their research abroad. And as you can see, we have a wide range of different positions, so from undergrad to senior researchers. Concerning the geographic distribution, we covered 9 countries and more than 20 different institutions in these countries. And well, our survey covered many topics, but today I brought these few examples, actually few examples inside each of these huge topics. So funding, human resources and infrastructure, and also international collaboration and English skills. So concerning funding, the example that I brought here was the differences in the monthly income in Latin America when compared to United States. So as you can see, usually when we consider a grad student or principal investigator salary in Latin America, what we see is that it is usually 3 to 6 times lower when compared to a United States salary. And of course, this impacts many things, but I have another example here of how this monthly income impact, for example, travel funds and registration in conferences. So WCPG is our main conference in our psychiatric genetic fields, and they have been helping a lot to sponsor middle and low and middle income countries to come to the conference, and also different from many conferences, they have different prices as you live in Latin America, for example. But even paying less, still it is more expensive for us to attend this conference than for a researcher in the United States. So, for example, it represents about 30% of our salary when compared to United States investigator. And of course, when you go to a conference, we expect to spend this money from a grant or for an institutional budget or travel funds. But the thing is that 80% of the researchers in Latin America has no institutional budget, and 62% has no travel funds at all. And even those, and here 34% of the researchers that reply to this survey who has access to a travel fund, still it is not actually enough to go to an international conference as WCPG. Okay, now about the second topic about human resources and infrastructure, I brought this message from one of our LAGC members that I think illustrated the difficulties in terms of human resources. He or she says, I would like to highlight the lack of staff. Students and PIs are usually the ones responsible for all activities in the lab, from simple lab activities, and here we are talking about reagent coding, opening the door, taking the phone, and to paperwork elaboration. So all the IRB bureaucratic papers, ethical submission, budget control, financial reports, and so on. And as a grad student in Brazil, 20% of my time was dedicated to real science, while during my experience abroad, this time was up to 80%. So to illustrate and to give you a picture how this lack of human resources have a huge impact in our productivity. And that's what we saw. We have many questions about human resources in each group. And what we see is that less than half of the groups have access to any secretary. And usually this is even more pronounced in South America, mainly Brazil and Colombia, in which more than half also lack a project manager. Okay, then we did many questions, and I think 15 or 20 questions here about specific difficulties that we thought could be very frequent in Latin America. And unfortunately, they were really frequent. And it was quite striking to see that about 70% of the researchers has some difficulty while accessing articles, paid articles. And the second example that I brought here, and it's more connected with a very chronic logistic problem we have in Latin America. So usually reagents take forever to go to the lab. And this obviously impacts the productivity and some PhD and postdoc projects. Okay, and now the third group of problems about barriers for international collaborations. We had a couple of questions about language difficulties. And while reading doesn't seem to be a problem for most of the countries, what we see is that more than half of the Brazilians and Colombians have some level of difficulty to write or to talk with a foreigner. So a clear barrier that would difficult international collaboration. And I got this message also from one of the LAGC members, in which she says that even being fluent in English, my writing was criticized while publishing an article, and we had to pay a native speaker for review. And that's very frequent for us. Every time we try to submit an article, we also need to expand a bit more with a native speaker review. And then we try to summarize and make a list of priorities and the main difficulties for all the group. And what we see is that the main difficulties in setting an international collaboration, the first two topics are very correlated to what I just presented. So lack of human resources impacting the bureaucracies and the paperwork to send samples abroad. The second one more related to the insufficient travel funds, so lack of adequate funds. So it is difficult for us to go to international conferences and start these new collaborations. And the third one was the one that I may say that really worried us, is that 50% of the people who replied to this survey report that they think that one barrier is equitable collaboration. So 50% of the Latin Americans here think that the international collaboration is not always equitable. And here, again, I brought some messages that the Latin American reported as difficulty to access samples after we send them abroad, and also after sending the samples abroad, it is also difficult to know where they are and how they are being used. And sometimes they continue to be used without giving credit to the research group. So these are a specific topic that I think that we discussed a lot with the PGC PI's last meeting. And I know that PGC will help us to change the mind of these Latin American researchers that are looking for equitable collaborations. And we need to guarantee this collaboration in the near future. Okay, and the last thing was which are the top 5 priorities. So the first one was help with cost of large-scale genomic approaches, and PGC has helped a bit already us with this. Give free online training on genomic analysis, helping to set up local genomic infrastructure. Of course, ideally for us, what we would want would be to genotype or sequence our sample in our own countries and analyze them in our own countries so we could collaborate with international collaborators. The fourth one was help with costs of a project manager, again, going back to this human resources difficulty. And the last one was enhance visibility of Latin American scientists in conferences. And I think that, and I'd like to take this point and also thank PGC for giving us this spot today to talk about our difficulties and our achievements, and also think with us what we can do different in the next few years. And just to finish, I brought here some ideas that we discussed a little bit about the short, middle, and long-term initiatives that we could do and that could have a good impact in Latin America. So like we are planning to do LAGC talks in national conferences. So the idea here would be to identify local leaders that we could bring to LAGC and also to PGC. We want to have one day a project manager dedicated to LAGC researchers, so we could save time of our Latin American researchers in this paperwork and with the difficulty to send samples abroad. And also we are planning to do training videos in our own language, so Portuguese or Spanish. As Janitza mentioned, access to a computational cluster or some kind of place that we could analyze the data, and also to find ways and discuss with PGC, WCPG, and other institutions how to improve ACP programs and travel funds for these researchers. And of course, the midterm and long-term ideas are things that are a bit more difficult, but usually they involve political aspects. But what we want is to see more collaborative funding opportunities in the future. I know that NIMH has already some opportunities for low and middle income countries, but we need to increase these opportunities. Also to improve human resources for the groups that have been collaborating with LAGC. And the last one, as midterm, we think that maybe having training programs where PhD students could do part of their PhD in Latin American part in the United States or Europe would be also a very good idea. And the last but not least, is to avoid brain drain. I know that most of the brilliant Brazilians that I met are today outside Brazil doing research. So I think that one thing we may aim in the long term is to avoid this brain drain. That's very drastic for the science in these countries. And of course, there is no easy solution, but maybe specific goals to keep these scientists in Latin America and also to give them fair salaries and fair conditions to do research in their own countries. And that's it. I'd like to highlight that if you are not part of LAGC yet, please join us. Here is our contact. You can send an email for us or talk with Janitza, Paola, and Elizabeth. And that I also would like to thank for organizing LAGC and doing all the hard work to start this. And we have monthly meetings and we hope to see you there. Thank you.
Thank you to all of our speakers. That was just an incredible set of presentations outlining what is going on, what is needed, and where we need to go. We have a few minutes for questions. There are some in the chat box. So we can go through those, but I also want to start by opening this up for anyone who would like to ask a question in Spanish or Portuguese while our speakers are here. So I think Grace can help us. Raise your hand and she will use her powers to unmute you. Any questions in Spanish or Portuguese? If not, or if you'd like to take a moment and raise your hand, that's great. There are some questions in the chat box. I'm going to open these up. I think our speakers can see these. The first one is from Dr. Mann, and I believe this is for you, Dr. Nicolini, about suicide rates and homicide rates. If you can see that on your screen, I'm happy to read it out too.
It's an interesting question if it's driving by guns. And, you know, at least in Mexico, guns are not allowed in the civilian population. So it's not, and the coroner's research that we have done is mainly by hanging the increase in deaths. So it's I think also an interesting difference is that it's much more related to substance use. So that has been a major problem that we have.
And I believe the next question is also for you, Humberto, about issues that are shared by psychiatry in the United States, from Dr. Davis.
Right. Yeah, I think it's you know, a lot of this complicated thing about the, you know, how to deal with the closing psychiatric hospital, and it's a thing on a current debate, and how to allocate funds to treat patients, and also I think they go along with doing research and increase knowledge of mental illness. And I think we need much more, you know, collaborative efforts and to share experiences in different parts of the world. And definitely we need advocate more for psychiatric care in the general medicine and also in the public health arena.
And I should read these questions out because our attendees can't see them. The first question was, when suicide rates and homicide rates correlate, it is usually driven by firearms availability. Is that what you think is going on here? And that's what Dr. Nicolini commented on first. And then the next question was from Dr. Davis. And her question specifically was about some of the issues that are shared by psychiatry in the US as well. Hospitals closing, no other options, debate over delegation. Could we solve these as an international community? I'll move on to our next one. This is from Dr. Zervis. How receptive are the general populations in Latin America to genetic studies? I believe this might be for Paola or Janitza.
Well, I can speak at least from the US, and maybe Humberto and Marcos can talk about in Latin America. I think in the US, the recent initiative of all of us has been very successful at, increasing that representation of Latin American researchers. So definitely mimicking their model to reach out to communities, Latin American communities around the US. And also maybe Paola can talk about other efforts as well, maybe from the eating disorders group from the PGC in the US.
Yeah, I think it's going to vary by how people have had negative experiences and how much knowledge there is in terms of like I think getting past the fact that like some of the people's assumptions of mental health and the fact that there's a genetic component. I think more awareness of the genetic component of psychiatric disorders can aid in participation in genetic studies. But I think like been working with many of these countries, we have like indigenous populations. I think there's a lot of local issues that need to be addressed when like doing recruitment and trying to get a feeling of like where people stand.
Thank you. Our next question is from Dr. Catherine Lewis, and this is for Dr. Nicolini. She says, the extent of deaths due to violence in Latin America was very worrying. Do you have any further information about the relationship with mental health, either as a cause of the violence or the effect on mental health through living in a society where violence is so prevalent?
Thanks, Catherine. We really don't know much about it. Up to very few years, there were no a lot of research like on PTSD or on the effects of arrests or problems with crime related to addiction in many Latin American countries. So I think the increase on the narco economies or all the problems that we are having in the Latin American societies. For example, in Mexico, it's believed that after oil, the second largest money movement is because of the drug. Of course, informal economy, but it's a huge economy. The drug-related economy, and the same happens in Colombia, the same happens in Peru and Bolivia, in many other countries, and I think that's a direct cause to violence, and of course I think there is a major component of mental health that it's very hard to study. It's very hard to study because the people are reluctant to dialogue with the health professionals due to the criminal activities involved into that. But it's a major issue, I think, in Latin America.
Thank you. This next question is from Dr. Davis. Would there be interest in volunteers who could serve as English language editors to provide assistance when language reviewed required by journals? These people could also perhaps provide some pushback on that issue when appropriate or requested by authors.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is one of the things where we found that this should be an easy solution. I think the PGC is so large, there's so many members that can provide assistance in this. I think that's one of the the low-hanging fruit in terms of aiding our membership.
And I know some of you have to leave. Thank you so much for joining. Our speakers, if you have time, we have a few more questions. But thank you to everybody who was able to join and provide their ears to this very important topic, and to our speakers. But I do have a couple more questions if you have time. The next one is from Dr. Adams, and they ask, what is the potential for genetics in admixed populations to change how we analyze samples that are traditionally considered homogeneous?
Right. So this question is very important, and I think one of the reasons why we established the methods working group is just to have, experts just dedicated on addressing the complexity of admixture in GWAS studies, because so far it hasn't been appropriately addressed, including our efforts, because we're just working with what's out there, but we have parallel efforts on improving methods that allow us to adequately account for the admixture in our population. So Paola briefly mentioned the tractor methods, and I know there are several people within PGC and LAGC that are applying tractor to Latin American populations, which was shown to perform really, really well in African American populations. So there is hope. I think the only limitation is the time of computing using these methods. But we hope to develop a method that is both efficient in terms of time and in accounting for the three-way admixture. And also it becomes more complex like that than that. So far, the admixture plots that we see often in Latin Americans are just a three-way admixture. But there's emerging research. I can mention research from Andres Moreno in Mexico that is looking for, four-way admixture in Latin Americans. So we need to take the next step and going to, for example, the incorporation of East Asian into our admixture composition. So it's always trying to be at the cutting edge of methods and in terms of development and applying it to databases. So if anyone is working on similar efforts and are interested in expanding those to Latin American ancestry, please reach out to us.
Yes, as Janitza said, we have methods group. So if you have ideas also, please come and help us.
So we unfortunately do have to wrap up, but there is an excellent question from Dr. Moreno de Luca in the chat. I was wondering if one of our speakers might be able to communicate with Dr. De Luca, and thank you, Janitza. It's an excellent question about returning clinically significant genomic data, something we're all grappling with. But unfortunately, Grace tells me we're out of time. Thank you so much to our speakers and our attendees for this fantastic session. Hopefully you'll all get to see each other soon in Florence. Have a great rest of the day, and thank you so much for joining the Worldwide Lab.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.